You're listening to the Cycling Podcast in association with Rapha. Rapha exists to improve your ride with the finest kit, inspiring stories, and vibrant clubhouses across the globe.
Where are we, Lionel?
We're in a Soho pub, Richard, in the centre of London.
Not just any Soho pub, Lionel. It's
No, I can't remember the name.
Famous literary pub, the Pillars of Hercules.
Oh, that's it, yeah.
Yeah. I'm with Lionel Birnie and Daniel Friebe.
Hello.
In person. Daniel.
English pronunciation, since I'm in England.
Daniel Friebe. Is it really you?
noticed.
Is it really you?
Yeah.
Tour de France
me.
haircut, I see.
Yeah. Okay. Crack
Lionel,
on, let's crack
Lionel,
on.
Tour de France haircut.
Yeah, yeah.
So, this is our Tour de France preview episode, I guess, isn't it?
Well, it's part 2 of a pre-Tour de France ramble.
A ramble, indeed. So, what we're going to do, just run through the stages, 1 to 20, and the teams, and maybe pick out a few riders to watch and stages to look out for, and do all that kind of traditional stuff.
I thought we'd go through the whole start list, all 176 riders, and decide which of who's and what's the final order of GC going to be. We'll do it in reverse order.
Okay, that's fine. So we'll get to Chris Froome in about 3.5 hours. Perfect. Excellent. No, there has, of course, been a major development. I mean, all our carefully laid plans for this Tour de France preview episode, we have to rip it up and start again, don't we?
Well, last week I think we knew that something was rumbling in the distance, and over the weekend, ASO made the first big move, didn't they? The Tour de France organisers announced that they were going to take steps to try and bar Chris Froome from taking the start. Of course, 4-time winner. He's had this salbutamol adverse analytical finding hanging over him publicly since late last year, and he's known about it since late September, I guess. That relates to last year's Vuelta, which he won, of course. And then on Monday, we got wind of the fact there was going to be some breaking news, and about 10 o'clock in the morning, the UCI's website was updated with a statement that Chris Froome had been cleared of any wrongdoing in the investigation relating to that salbutamol adverse analytical finding, and he is free to ride the Tour de France.
We'll get on to that. We will talk about this, obviously, in detail. But before we do that, why don't we go on to the news roundup?
Just sticking with the UCI for a moment. Last week, I should have mentioned this last week, but I forgot because I accidentally deleted my text window whilst working on my Tour de France spreadsheet. But the UCI announced that from January the 1st next year, tramadol will be added to the banned list. So riders...
Can I ask a question about the Tour de France spreadsheet?
You can.
Has it got a wheels roll column in it, like we had at the Giro?
The logistics spreadsheet doesn't.
If it hasn't, you're going to flounder, and I'm going to take great delight in watching you flounder.
What you think that we need to? Yeah,
we
it
need to
did
add a
work
wheels
well on
roll column.
Yeah, what time we leave the hotel? I think I will do that. I'll do that when Richard drives us to the Vendée on Thursday. I've got 6 hours in the passenger seat on Thursday. No, just joking. A whole raft of national championship road races. I've run through some of the winners. Lucas Pustelberger of Bora Hansgrohe won the Austrian title, so he'll be wearing that jersey in the Tour de France. Bob Jungels won the Luxembourg title. Michael Murkow won the Danish title. Anthony Roux won in France. Mathieu van der Poel won in the Netherlands. Steve Morabito won in the Swiss Mafia territories. Pascal Ackermann.
Mafia involved
See
in that
our
at all?
Giro podcast.
Yeah, that's a Giro reference for anyone catching up. Pascal Ackermann won the German title. Connor Dunn won in Ireland. And Connor Swift of Madison Genesis won the Great Britain title. I didn't know this, but he is Ben Swift's cousin, Rich. Yeah. But he was also part of the Madison Genesis team, and a little opportunity to plug our Lunch with Colin Sturgis episode.
Any relation to Taylor?
Taylor Swift?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, I think Taylor Swift is Ben Swift's older sister. Is she not?
Shame he's not going to be on the tour in that case. She won't be watching. Anyway.
Colin Sturgis Friends of the Podcast special was released a few weeks ago in 2 parts. It's had a really good reception, but already the Jean Bobet episode, Rich, that's been released this morning. Yesterday
We'll hear a
morning.
little clip from that later in the episode.
Yeah, a tremendous work. I listened to the first 15 minutes on the train this morning. Looking forward to listening to the rest a bit later on. The Tour de France is nearly here. It starts on Saturday, of course, and all of the lineups have now been announced.
Sorry, can I interrupt one more time?
Yeah.
Napalm, did you mention Viviani?
No.
I didn't mention Viviani. No, he won
One of the
last
most
week.
surprising. Did
Or
he?
was-
No, it was. It
Was it
the
this weekend?
Yeah.
Sorry, Elia Viviani won the Italian title. Was that a surprise win?
It was a surprise because of the manner in which he won. He won in a 3-man group.
Not a surprise that he would outsprint 2 other riders, perhaps,
No.
but getting into a break. But that's the nature of national championships, isn't it? Unpredictable racing. So, yeah, the Tour de France is nearly here. All of the lineups have now been announced. Team Sky were the last to announce their team. They're around about an hour or so ago. No major surprises in it. Cofidis are not taking Nasser Buhani, their sprinter. Has he ever ridden the Tour?
He
Buhani?
has.
He has ridden the
A
Tour,
few
yeah.
times, yeah.
Has
I
he?
read it last year.
Oh, I did, yeah. It was the year before he missed after
Having a
the
dust up in
altercation
his
at the National
hotel.
Championships.
Remember the last time the race finished in Amiens, he crashed on the way in, I think, didn't he? That year? He's
Yeah.
never won a stage.
No. Another rider missing is Wilco Kelderman, not able to ride for Team Sunweb because he crashed at the Dutch National Championships. Another bit of Tour de France related, not quite team news, but we mentioned last week Fortuneo Samsic, Warren Barguil's team changing their bike supplier very close to the Tour de France. They ditched Look bicycles and are going to be riding BH bicycles, which is a Basque country. No,
Basque,
it's
yeah.
Basque, isn't it? A Basque
Former gun
country.
manufacturer.
In
That's right.
Eibar.
The Rafa Cycling Club is the largest global community of its kind. Members share their passion for the road through rides, events, exclusive club kits and racing. Find out more at rafa.cc.
Thank you very much to our headline sponsor, Rafa. We're grateful as ever for their support. And like everybody else in the cycling world, everybody at Rafa is looking forward to the biggest race of the season. Over the next 4 weeks, Rafa clubhouses around the world will host 1,400 rides, 150 events and parties, and of course, live screenings of all 21 days of racing. To join a ride, attend an event, or find out when the racing is on, see your local clubhouse schedule. You can also check rafa.cc.
So there we are. So the next time you hear from us, well, other than this episode, we will be in France with Francois Thomazeau for our Tour de France coverage, which starts on Saturday and settled into the regular routine now of daily episodes after every stage, Kilometre Zero every weekday morning, which will be sponsored by Hansgrohe.
Delighted to welcome Hans Grohe into the Cycling Podcast family. We've been speaking to them the last few weeks.
We won't be seeing adverts featuring photos of you showering, will we?
No,
That's certainly
definitely not.
We've certainly not agreed to that at this stage.
No.
But yeah, they'll be sponsoring Kilometre Zero Monday to Friday every weekday during the tour.
Yeah, and we'll be doing the press conference episode on the rest days again, on the 2 Monday rest days and also on the Monday after the Tour de France. And if anyone wants to ask us a question about any aspect of the tour or our coverage, they can leave a voice message on WhatsApp. Then the phone number is in our Twitter biography.
So Chris Froome is the big news, isn't he? Let's just get straight into that. The news, as you said, Lionel, came on Monday that he was going to be not cleared because it's been reported as the doping case against Chris Froome dropped. Well, there never was a doping case. There was potentially an adverse analytical finding that was being investigated. A lot of misreporting about this. I mean, the fact is that we usually don't know about adverse analytical findings unless they become anti-doping rule violations. So the precedents we have are cases that have eventually led to a punishment or suspension. But looking at the WADA report from 2016. In 2016, there were 3,000, just over 3,000 adverse analytical findings. That's across all sports, of which 44% became anti-doping rule violations. So 56% never resulted in any kind of doping suspension. Just an interesting bit of context to this, because I think there's a perception that Chris Froome has been treated differently, but in fact his adverse analytical finding puts him, and what's happened with it, puts him in the majority.
I suppose the circumstances, Rich, of the announcement, and certainly the timing of the announcement, caught us by surprise to a certain extent. We always feared that it would come to a head in the week before the Tour de France. Exactly what the subplot that has played out in the last few weeks has been, we're not quite sure. ASO went to this court of arbitration for French sport, in effect, in June. I suspect that they might have ASO might have talked to Dave Brailsford. Remember, we talked during the Dauphiné about the possibility of Brailsford having a meeting with ASO. He denied it, but I think that maybe happened, and maybe ASO came away from that realising that there was no way Sky were not going to field Chris Froome at the Tour de France. And from there, we jump ahead to the start of this week, and it was sort of leaked to Le Monde that ASO had made this appeal, and a decision was going to be made on Tuesday or Wednesday. And it looked very much from that as though, certainly in light of the verdict that we learned yesterday, it looked as though ASO were sort of window dressing, making it look as though they'd done everything right, whatever the verdict was going to be with Froome, that they wouldn't have accepted him if this hadn't been resolved. Whether ASO were able to exert any pressure to accelerate the verdict being announced, we don't really know. But as far as Sky and Froome were concerned, I think we were all quite aware in the spring that they were very confident. I certainly got the impression in the second half of the Giro that any sort of hesitation, any uncertainty about whether they were going to field Froome or not, about whether they were going to sort of take a diplomatic decision to sit him out of this year's Tour, that had all evaporated. And I remember on I think it was the last week of the Giro, the final time trial, we got wind, Rich, of the sort of planning that was going into the Tour de France then for Froome, and Dave Brailsford, I think, had a meeting with Chris Froome about all of the things that he needed to do to raise his game for the Tour de France, and their focus at that point was very much on how he was going to perform at the Tour.
It's interesting because, scrolling back a little bit, there was a period before the Giro when there was definitely the mood in the Sky camp was that Froome was going to be suspended. That I think they sensed a determination on the part of WADA and the UCI to prosecute Froome, to not leave themselves open to the accusation that they treated him differently. And I certainly picked up the vibe that they were not confident at all that he would ride the Giro, and certainly not the Tour. And that was around Tour of the Alps time. I think it was linked possibly also to his questionable form at the time, and that's always thrown into the mix. And I think the first 2 weeks of the Giro, when he was out of sorts, the question was, well, and we were talking about, will Froome ever win another Grand Tour, weren't we? It seemed that the case and all the pressure on it had really affected him, and that it wouldn't maybe have made an awful lot of sense for him to go into the Tour. Then, of course, that all turned around the final week of the Giro.
Yeah, I mean, what everyone wanted going into the Tour de France was some kind of clarity, one way or the other. Chris Froome either barred from taking part, the Tour could have continued without the whole circus carrying over him, or Chris Froome cleared and able to start, and at least the clarity of that decision having been made. Whether or not in the court of public opinion this has really cleared anything up for people who are minded not to believe in Froome and Team Sky, I think that, well, I've seen various comments on social media and that I agree with. No one's mind has been changed by this verdict, really. All it's done is kind of kick the tin can along the pavement a little bit and change the nature of the debate. Already it's moving on to whether or not this is a blow for the entire anti-doping effort. I think the two key things to remember about this whole case are, firstly, that salbutamol is not an outright banned substance. So when I see people comparing it to the Alberto Contador case from a few years ago, which was with a banned substance, clenbuterol, there isn't a comparison there, because salbutamol is permitted without a TUE, even without a therapeutic use exemption, up to this dosage limit. The other misconception that has been misreported in a lot of places is that the amount that shows up in the urine sample is like that's a positive test, and it's not. It's an orange flag, really, to then go back and give the athlete time in private to justify and explain whether or not the dose was exceeded. And so the big problem in the fallout from this whole case is that because we all crave a kind of simple black and white with these cases, people want to know, well, was he positive or wasn't he positive? What's gone on here? And I think the unfortunate thing is that there's not a great deal of detail in even the WADA press release.
Do you think it's incumbent on them to provide more detail? I mean, I was quite heartened when Oliver Rabin, I think is he a francophone?
Rabin,
Olivier. Yeah. I was quite heartened when the WADA science director, he's given an interview to Matt Slater, gave a bit more detail. And I said something on Twitter yesterday about in the post sort of Festina, Puerto age, then we have got this public which is very well informed on anti-doping matters, legal matters, medical matters, and they seem to crave information, and transparency has become a buzzword in professional cycling over the last 10 or 15 years, rightly so. And people want to know exactly what happened, how this went down, how come he's being cleared. The other side of that argument, the other side of that coin, of course, is that it doesn't generally change people's minds. And also, this should all have been private in the first place. So why now should it be incumbent on anyone, on Chris Froome, on the UCI, on WADA to go into forensic detail about what's actually happened in this case? The one caveat to that, I would say, is that it's the UCI's duty, because the UCI were responsible for bringing this into the public domain. So it's their responsibility now to really give all the information they can to explain why Chris Froome, that the damage, the collateral damage that's been done to Chris Froome's reputation has been done unfairly.
The problem is with this clamour for more information is who then is qualified to assess it and tell us what it means, because I'm not. And so WADA and UCI could release all the medical information in the world about this, and I would then be relying on what other people tell me it means. Now, the problem with at the moment is, and this is part of a much wider trend where there's a high level of suspicion around institutions, organizations, people in power, experts as well. And so you have, in a situation like this, you have a vacuum, because the actual experts who have spent 9 months looking at this, and WADA appoint independent experts to really guide them. We don't know who they are. We don't hear from them. So, and that's sort of protocol. But I just wonder if more information was to be released, I'd welcome that on the one hand. But on the other, who then do we? Whose voice do we then pay attention to?
But is there a happy medium? And in practical terms, could, for example, the UCI on Wednesday tomorrow or on Thursday at the Tour de France, should David Lapartien, the UCI president, give a press conference with one of the UCI's medical experts, with someone from WADA, spend 15 minutes answering questions?
I mean, some information that might come out in which, I've been told is that one of the aspects of this case that made it a little bit different to some other salbutamol cases was that Froome has been, because the salbutamol test is a urine test, he's obviously been urine tested an awful lot. They were able to build up a profile over time of the levels of salbutamol in his urine, and they had that studied, and the variation was such that it was reckoned that over time it was an inevitability that he would go over the limit at some point. Now, the thing that a lot of people are most concerned by is the amount that he was over the limit, apparently 2 times the limit. If you factor in dehydration, it was apparently 19% of the limit. That's what we're told.
Which has only been factored into WADA's reckoning since the end of last year. They actually changed their technical guidelines on how to analyse urine samples for salbutamol last year to take into account the specific gravity.
The key thing in this is, and I'm no scientist, but this is the fact of this test that jumps out to me, is that the urine test tells you how much salbutamol is in the urine. It doesn't tell you how much salbutamol has been ingested. So it's going to be highly variable depending on how hydrated or not the athlete is. And that seems to me to be a real fundamental flaw in this test. That if you're taking the urine sample as a measure of how much salbutamol somebody has been taking, it's flawed.
But there has to be some way of measuring. I mean, it's the same with other substances. And
but it's the difference between whether Froome took more than he was allowed to or not, isn't it?
But any threshold.
But the thing here is that the rule is written on that there is a limit on how much you take. The amount that shows up in the urine sample is purely a guide. If you have more in the sample than the limit, then it gets kind of referred back, right, what questions do we have to ask here? This is and then if the threshold is exceeded, this is now an adverse analytical finding. Okay, let's all look at this kind of calmly and dispassionately and see whether there's an anti-doping rule violation. And that is, as I said, that has been completely lost in this case, because really the fundamental thing about this is that it's about trust. It's about trust in professional cycling, trust in authority. And we have, years and years of trust eroded by successive anti-doping cases, real rampant doping through, not just years, but decades, really. And so there isn't the kind of the benefit of the doubt given to the sport. And there certainly isn't the benefit of the doubt given to Team Sky, largely, I think, because of the Bradley Wiggins situation, where they really, find it very hard to argue against the case that they were sort of gaming the system in terms of the exploiting the TUE regulations for benefit. Earlier today, I met with Jonathan Vaughters, who's in London prior to the Tour de France. He's the boss of the Education First Drapac team. Managed to get
powered by Cannondale.
Powered by Cannondale, yes. Is Drapac still involved? Oh,
yes.
heavens! But he had some really interesting things to say about the Chris Froome case.
Well, it's a complex reaction. On one hand, I would say this is a really good lesson for the fans, for the media, for riders, for everyone involved in cycling, to take the process of justice and the process of justice and anti-doping a little bit more seriously, and stop being so knee-jerk reaction to an initial test or an initial rumor or whatever it is, and just automatically jumping to conclusions. What everyone has to fundamentally understand is that this case never even got to the point of being a case. The UCI and WADA were determining whether or not they even wanted to pursue this, and whether or not this test was a valid adverse analytical finding, to the point where they might try to pursue an ADRV. They decided that they weren't going to pursue it. With almost any other rider, well, I'll just say with any other rider, none of what happened would have ever been public. It would have never been public, because the process in deciding whether or not we're going to pursue an AAF is normally a completely confidential process, because the rider is presumed innocent at first, and the rider is given certain rights of privacy until there is enough facts to try and pursue an ADRV. That was completely bastardized by somebody leaking this to the press. And whoever that person is, and I hope they're listening to this, what you did was horrible to leak that out. Now, if he had tested, if it was a confirmed AAF, and if it became a confirmed anti-doping rule violation, should that be public? Should that be transparent? Should the process be transparent? Absolutely, but not at the point at which it was released to the press. That was just, I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, this person, whoever it is, works for the UCI or someone around there, and the fact that they leaked it to the press it's just vindictive, and I don't know what their motivation was, but it really makes me angry, because it's not just Chris Froome. That could have happened to anyone. So there's that. That said, I think the whole situation was made worse by Team Sky's attitude toward it, and the management and the history of the organization. I think people view them very skeptically. They don't view them as being credible at all. Clearly, with the whole Shane Sutton, Brad Wiggins, TUE, Richard Freeman, Jiffy Bag disaster, it showed that they're unwilling to be honest as an organization, that, in order to protect their theoretical zero tolerance policy, that they're basically willing to do anything to just keep a level of opaqueness in front of what's really going on. And I think that when this Froome situation hit, the fact that there just really isn't any credibility there, and the fact that they aren't transparent whatsoever, turned the public against them in a really nasty way. And in some ways, I almost feel that Froome, I don't want to say was an unfortunate victim, but he definitely caught the sharp edge of the sword, because of all of the history of Sky, and and I don't have a lot of sympathy towards the fact that it was given such a negative reaction. He was given such a negative reaction because of the way they've treated the media, because of the way they've treated fans, because of the very arrogant attitude that they treat the rest of cycling. To me, there's not a lot of sympathy there. But again, going back to my first point, I do have sympathy, not just for Chris Froome, but any athlete that would have been at that stage in the anti-doping process, and to have a preliminary sort of finding released public and to be judged guilty as a result of that. That's just wrong. We don't do that in the rest of society. We don't do that in a modern, when I say modern, I mean the last 300 years, sort of post-Magna Carta, post-Declaration of Independence, post-Constitution, post-Bill of Rights Western society. We don't do that to people. And in this sport, we just chose to essentially, eat the guy alive before, not before he'd been declared guilty, before he'd even been officially charged with anything. So this is the fundamental reason that confidentiality and privacy in the initial phases of these sorts of investigations exists, because anti-doping science isn't simple. Anti-doping adjudication isn't simple. For some reason, the impression in the public is that it's sort of a binary, it's black or it's white, it's positive or it's negative. That is not the way anti-doping science works. And the people who spend countless hours in the lab, who are actually, a lot of the people involved in anti-doping, they're not doing it for the money. They're very passionate about fairness in sport, and they're working as scientists, endless hours because they're passionate about, protecting the rights of clean athletes. That said, it's just not simple. Like, those laboratory procedures are very, very difficult to get in an exact answer that is 100% defensible. I mean, putting the salbutamol test to the side for a minute, the EPO test as an example, as a best example, people assume that if someone tests positive for EPO, that it's sort of they found EPO in his system. No, wrong. EPO is already in your system. Every time you urinate, you're excreting EPO isoforms. In the non-recombinant form, meaning that it's naturally come from your body, you're excreting erythropoietin isoforms. how do you distinguish those erythropoietin isoforms in your urine from ones that came from recombinant erythropoietin? It's very difficult, very difficult. The charge is probably slightly different between a recombinant EPO that would have been synthesized in the human body versus one that would be, actually recombinant EPO is synthesized from hamster ovaries. There's a little factoid for you. The charge is just ever so slightly different, but the scale in which they judge that on, it's almost like they run it through two magnets and see, well, which separates to the side of the positive charge and which side is the negative charge. But it's where they put that line of saying, okay, enough have separated off to the positive or enough have separated off to the negative side that we're going to call this a positive test or a negative test. It's not entirely arbitrary, but it is not black and white. It is very much like, is that turquoise? Is that green? Is that blue? Is that light blue? And at some point in time, they draw a line and say, okay, we're going to declare this one a positive test. But it isn't this simple yes-no process. And that's true across most of anti-doping. It is never a simple yes or no. And so, are there false negatives sometimes? Athletes that have taken stuff, or have they avoided the test or whatever else? Are there false negatives or intentionally avoided negative tests even when a guy is doping? Yes. But there are also false positives. And, I grew up with a father who told me 1,000 times over the Thomas Jefferson quote of Jeffersonian justice, that it is better to let 100 guilty men go free than it is to imprison one innocent man. And I believe that, and that is part of my ethos, 100%. And that let's forget about the dopers that got away with it. Let's think about the guy who never doped that got a suspension for something he never did, and think about how much of a tragedy that is before we go in and we start judging, what anti-doping is, or was it effective, and why can't they be stronger about it, and so on and so forth. You have to be very careful with putting innocent people out of work, out of a profession, and ending their passion in life. Really, because that's what it would be if you ended your career as a professional cyclist due to a false anti-doping positive. Salbutamol is tricky. It's not banned. Like you said, it's a restricted substance. You can take it. You just can't take too much of it. And why is that rule in place? And this is, again, why a lot of people don't understand, is that that rule is in place because if you are to administer salbutamol generally, meaning via a pill or via an injection as opposed to inhaled, it can have an anabolic effect, muscle-building effect. So that's the reason that rule exists, and that's the reason that limit exists. What WADA is trying to do there is basically say, yes, we understand that that athletes with exercise-induced asthma, which a lot of athletes have and validly have because of the amount of air they're breathing in and out, that it's a chronic inflammation in the bronchial system. The whole notion that like asthma is this invented thing in professional sports is a bunch of crap, because athletes, the amount of inflammation that's caused by pollen and pollution and everything else because they're constantly exercising so hard is something that is exponentially larger than in the general population. So the need for salbutamol to just get guys to breathe normally is real and there. And so WADA recognizes that. But they were trying to prevent people from abusing it in order to get an anabolic effect. Basically, that's why that limitation exists. The excretion patterns, meaning how much you excrete one day versus the next, totally independent of the dose that you're actually consuming, that's also something that can vary with any element, not just salbutamol. One thing to consider, and this isn't necessarily in defense of Froome, but it is one way, is that if you wanted to use the salbutamol to have an anabolic effect, in his situation, you'd probably want to be doing that sort of before the Vuelta started to build up muscle tissue for the race. At that point in time, an anabolic effect is probably not going to be too advantageous to you. You're sort of far enough into the race that it's not necessarily going to have a muscle building effect isn't necessarily going to help you that much. So that's maybe one thing that WADA took into consideration. I'm not sure. I don't really know. But I don't have a problem with people using salbutamol in the peloton whatsoever. I don't have a problem with people using salbutamol as athletes. I used albuterol in my day racing, which is sort of a shorter acting, version of salbutamol. We've had plenty of riders on our team over the years that have used salbutamol, inhaled salbutamol. So what happened here and why the concentration was so high and what the motivation was there and so on and so forth, none of us know the answer to that. Only Chris Froome knows the answer to that.
Chute à l'arrière du peloton, cycling podcast team car at the back of the pack, please.
That's the voice of Seb Piquet, race radio at the Tour de France, to remind us to tell you that this week's episode is sponsored by The Economist. The Economist is about far more than just economics and finance. It covers a range of subjects from politics and business to science, technology, the arts and the environment.
The Economist helps readers prepare for what is going on in the world around them, and in today's dynamic world, facts matter more than ever.
For over 170 years, The Economist has delivered trustworthy intelligence that helps people like you, that's the listeners and us, choose where to stand on the issues that matter most. Now, Rich, you've been looking through The Economist this week. What's caught your eye?
I've been perusing it on my phone, Lionel. It was an article with a great headline, The Television Will Be Revolutionized, which is obviously a twist on the revolution will be televised. And it's all about Netflix, a company that is hugely interesting just because of the amount of original content they're creating and the number of people who are prepared to pay for that. From a selfish point of view, as somebody who runs a podcast with a couple of colleagues, it's reassuring that people are prepared to pay for stuff when so much is free in the media. But the figures behind Netflix are just astonishing. I love how in The Economist they have lines like Goldman Sachs, a bank, they think that Netflix will be spending an annual $22.5 billion on content by 2022, which is just remarkable. And as I say, whatever you think of Netflix and their aspirations to become a sort of dominant player in the market, which probably ultimately wouldn't do anyone any favours, there's an awful lot of new stuff being made thanks to that model, and that is kind of reassuring, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting because the one thing that's broadcast that is kind of protected from the Netflix model, if you like, is live sport, isn't it? Because live sport is it's very desirable to watch when it's actually live, but not so much later on. I mean, people will watch highlights programs, of course, but live sport is something that you would think that the major broadcasters would at least think is going to survive the sort of Netflix revolution.
Absolutely. And the other thing that's very interesting also for those of us that work in and are interested in a niche sport like cycling, there are Netflix's ability to cater for so many different niches and create really high quality programs and films and documentaries for those people is unrivaled, and their ability to the algorithms that go into targeting viewers with things that they might be interested in is incredibly sophisticated, a little bit scary, but for the moment at least it seems that the viewer is the winner.
Well, The Economist is a smart guide to the forces changing your world, and you can get a free copy now. For your free print copy of The Economist, just text cycling to 78070. That's cycling to 78070. It was really interesting listening to Jonathan Vaughters talk. Obviously, a doper himself, an ex-doper himself.
Still doping, is he?
No, I don't think so. I'm not sure. You need to.
I don't think so.
I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, he looked.
Did you study the whites of his eyes?
Yeah, I'm narrowing my eyes here, thinking about this question. No, but his entire team was founded out of a desire to compete clean at a time when the sport was in a really terrible place. I mean, the Slipstream team became Garmin Cervelo, Garmin Sharp, and now EF Education First. Oh well, Cannondale as well in between then. they were founded 10 years ago, 2008. And because I was talking to Jonathan about the foundation of the team and their first Tour de France, you'll be able to hear a bit about that in the next week or so. I was looking back at the 2008 Tour, which we all covered, and just made a list of the things that happened in that race. You know, Tom Boonen sat out that race because he had tested positive for cocaine out of competition. He was kind of rested by the Quick Step team. Manuel Beltran of Liquigas tested positive for EPO in the first week. Stefan Schumacher, who won the time trial in Cholet, he tested positive for Sierra, which is a kind of variation of EPO. Chris Froome's Barlow World teammate Moses Duenas tested positive for EPO. Ricardo Rico, of course, won 2 stages, tested positive for Sierra. Leonardo Piepoli, his teammate, he also pulled out of the race because of ethical misunderstandings.
Joyous way to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Festina scandal it was.
Yeah, exactly. Dmitry Fofanov tested positive for heptaminol, which is a stimulant. Alejandro Valverde was deeply suspected to be involved in the Operation Puerto case. Yeah, and he was only caught because the race went into Italy to Prato Nervoso, where the Italian Olympic Committee were waiting, and they were entitled to test him. They tested him, they compared the DNA and those samples to some Operation Puerto blood bags, and he got a 2-year suspension for that. Valverde back in the race, of course, this year as part of the Movistar squad. Bernard Cole, Austrian rider, finished 3rd overall and was later stripped of that place for Sierra.
Not everyone was a loser in that case, so were they, Daniel?
Did you back Bernard Cole for the podium?
To win the King of the Mountains, no?
I'm afraid that worked out rather well for me.
That's almost as bad as my Floyd Landis example from two years earlier, where I backed Floyd Landis to win the race after well early in the spring, after he won Paris-Nice at some ridiculous price, and I was frantically cashing out.
It was 50 to 1.
It was 50
for
to
most
1
of the spring. Yeah,
I had 25 quid on, and I was pressing Unibet's cash out button quite persistently on the. But
I'm pure. I've never not
pure.
ethically compromised in the same way as my colleagues here.
But a lot of people have. Again, I don't want to be overly influenced by sort of social media reaction, but it's kind of indicative of how people are feeling, and they're well, this is the straw that breaks the camel's back. But you look back 10 years, that tour was absolutely
riddled with it.
As you say, Rich, Daniel, what a great way to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Festina affair that was. I mean, the tour nearly ground to a halt in 98. 10 years before that, in 1988, Pedro Delgado won the race. He tested positive for a substance called probenecid, which was on the IOC's banned list but hadn't been added to the UCI's banned list, so he kind of got away with that. 10 years before that, Michel Pelletier tried to cheat the doping test at Alpe d'Huez with a bag of fresh urine from a mechanic or a soigneur. He'd just won the stage and taken the yellow jersey. He got kicked out of the race. And 10 years before that, in 1968, Jean Stablinski and Jose Samin were both kicked out of what was supposed to be the Tour of Renewal, the Tour of Purity. The 1968 race was the year after Tom Simpson had died. Simpson, of course, amphetamines in his system.
58 was all right, though, no? 58. Was that Charlie Gaulle, 58?
58, yeah.
48 was Gino Bartoli.
Yeah, so cycling...
38 was Gino Bartoli, who won in 1928.
But the point I'm trying to make is that, if you'd said to me in 2008, as we finished that tour, with all of those scandals, stage winners after stage winner, a guy on the podium, all kicked out for not light doping, serious heavyweight substances, EPO, next generation EPO, blood doping. If you said, well, in 10 years' time, the big scandal will be salbutamol, I mean, it's just night and day. It really is.
Well, you wouldn't have believed it, would you?
I wouldn't have believed it back then. But, and even in saying that...
This is the kind of the point, though, isn't it? I mean, we are getting exercised by this. And it does... There's a danger that it... with all this history of doping over the years, there are still, obviously, riders and teams looking to, if not cheat, then go as close to the line as possible. And there's always been this question about whether this salbutamol case was a bit of a red herring because, if Froome had been overdosing on salbutamol, and we don't really know why he would have been doing that, there was 100% certainty, really, of him being caught because, it's a very simple urine test. He was being tested every day.
Yeah, well, he's in the race lead, wasn't he? I mean, it's... The thing is, even in saying this, it sounds like I'm kind of minimising or playing down the seriousness of this whole story, and of course it's hung like a cloud over the whole of the cycling season so far, and I suppose it's very difficult to sort of reach a conclusion when, like I say, compared to what was going on 10 years ago.
I think a lot of people have talked about the implications of this for anti-doping in general, particularly as it seems as though Goliath has come in, i.e. a very well-funded Team Sky, and Chris Froome, and they've sort of taken David to the cleaners, i.e. WADA, and that is true. And there is a fundamental injustice in the fact that a rich athlete and a rich team has the heft, has the resources to be able to spend months and months compiling a dossier in a way that Alessandro Petacchi perhaps didn't in 2007 when he tested positive, in a way that Diego Alisi didn't. He was backed Alisi for a certain amount of time by his team, and then they kind of left him to fight his own case, and he lost in a case that was ostensibly very similar to Chris Froome. But I've talked before about this is the problem. Now, with the stakes in anti-doping are so high when bans are 2 years, 4 years, and in this particular case, this was a multi-million dollar decision. Whether Chris Froome was going to be guilty or not guilty, tens of millions rested on this. Sky sponsorship rested on this, and whether Chris Froome was going to win more Tours de France, and WADA simply do not have the resources to fight that kind of case. Anti-doping does not have the resources to play on those tables in the casino. They're midgets wielding bazookas, because as soon as it is about 4 years, 8 years, people's careers, then the big boys, the Team Skies, they're going to come in with all their heft and their tens of millions and their lawyers. And maybe they're also going to devote more time, more resources to researching salbutamol than WADA scientists and all of have ever been able to do. So maybe Sky and Froome they know more about salbutamol than the amount of knowledge that went into defining those rules in the first place. And
well, as Jonathan Vaughters made the point, and perhaps we'll hear what he says now about it being a poorly worded rule and a poorly researched threshold.
Well, exactly. There's this idea that is that WADA, people see professional sport and they see the amount of money and the glitz and the glamour, and they imagine that the rules and the authorities and the kind of officialdom behind all of that is on the same scale, that it's at the same level of professionalism, the same amount of resources. But WADA's annual budget is the same as Team Sky's, but it's $32 million. Last year it was $32 million. That's more or less what Team Sky's is. And it is possible that their laws were put together on a relative shoestring. When you consider the resources that Sky will have pumped into this Tour de France, and research into bikes and research into this and research into that.
Absolutely, and WADA's still quite a young organisation. It was set up in the aftermath and as a result of the Festina affair, and it came into existence 2000. It's 18 years old. It's not that old an organisation. And that's not a lot of time to develop an anti-doping code, which they have, with, hundreds, thousands of substances on it.
And we saw with the meldonium case and the Russian athletes a couple of years ago that they were challenged and embarrassed on that. They'd got a lot of their science was kind of faulty and incomplete, and they paid the price for that. That also cost them a huge amount of money. The Mahamadou Sakho, the Liverpool footballer who challenged it was an adverse analytical finding and ultimately won. That was a hugely costly legal case, and I can well imagine that they balked at the idea of going into battle with someone like Chris Froome. And as I said, they're paupers at the high rollers tables. It's fine as long as people are talking about bans or middle-ranking athletes where, you know, the implications, even if a legal case goes wrong, the implications are 1 million or 2 million. But when you are talking about Chris Froome, Team Sky, you're talking about, as I said, tens of millions in terms of implications. And the high rollers come to the table and they say, well, okay, if you want to play with us, you can't afford to settle your debts. We're going to take your house. And that is effectively the position that WADA are in.
It is, but there's also something to consider that is the salbutamol rule, is that the one to kind of dig heels in over and you know, could potentially be bankrupted as a result of a you know, it's not a serious enough substance. It's you know, if it was a banned substance, you could understand how you know, they might dig in and say, no, we're going to fight this on an equal footing, or try to fight this on an equal footing. But that's the big thing about this, is that it's a substance that is allowed up to that threshold without even a TUE. So it really is at the kind of the perimeter of.
Yeah, and it is a bit of a distraction, really. The problem is that the big moves in anti-doping come off the back of an existential crisis, which is what Festina kind of was, and you need that in order to get the impetus behind setting up WADA in the first place, and then giving it the funding that it needs. And you're thinking about this. I mean, what do people who watch sport want more than anything? They want to believe what they see, and so. Is there some way? I mean, governments contribute to WADA, the IOC contributes to WADA, but it's peanuts. You know, how could that massive global audience that there is for sport, you know, how could they help to make it a fit for purpose organisation?
I think I calculated last year, Rich. I don't have the sums to hand, but Nike turnover in a day worldwide 4 times what WADA's budget is in a year.
The Cycling Podcast is supported by Science in Sport. Science in Sport. Fueled by science.
Thank you very much indeed to Science in Sport for supporting the Cycling Podcast. We're very grateful to them. They've been on board now since 2016 Giro. They came on Science in Sport, so they've been long-time supporters of ours, and we're very grateful to them. The code for 25% off all Science and Sport products, or all non-discounted Science and Sport products, is SISCP25. That's SISCP25. If you enter that at the checkout on the website, scienceandsport.com, you get 25% off. Now, anything else on the Chris Froome case before we move on?
Well, I was going to say, well, I mentioned earlier the need for kind of clarity. We now know he'll be on the start line. He's always insisted that it's his right to ride, and of course, if due process had been respected right from the start, this case would not have been played out in the public domain, and no one would have known about it, I guess. But for the leak, the fact that it has been played out in the public domain, the fact that Bernardino, 5-time winner, much respected figure in France, made some comments a couple of weeks ago saying that Froome shouldn't be in the Tour de France. The fact that ASO made a move to try and bar him won't have helped Froome and Team Sky a great deal in terms of how they will be received by the public, because let's face it, I mean, we're kind of scrambling to keep up with the science of this and the rules and the you know, the rights and wrongs of the actual case. You know, for a lot of people, this is just a doping case that's been basically Sky have got the financial muscle to pay off, and I completely see that is how people see it. I mean, you know, that's what it looks like from the outside, and I think that for people who are watching the race, I can't imagine that Sky will be any more popular than they've been in the past as a result of Froome being cleared of this.
And I think, you know, it's possible to hold two apparently contradictory positions and say that, you know, that there's a lot that was wrong about this case, and that perhaps justice has been done if Froome, as he insists, didn't take more than the permitted dose of salbutamol and triggered the AAF. However, it's also possible at the same time to be critical of Froome and Team Sky, not just for this, but in general. I don't think we're talking about WADA not being fit for purpose. I don't think Team Sky have adapted behaved very well in this era that we're in, where there is this clamour for more information, more transparency. They often talk about it, but there's a lot more they could have done, in terms also of allowing things to be said and not challenging them. Now, I think that they've been very, very wary of going down the same path as Lance Armstrong used to go down.
I think they've pivoted on that very recently.
Right.
And I think there's been a personnel change, hasn't there, in the communications department. And the statement when Bernardino criticised Chris Froome and suggested he shouldn't be at the Tour de France, when they responded to that, Team Sky, that was very uncharacteristic based on their past behaviour.
Their strategy, the policy has been just to let this stuff go. Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how they decide to tackle the Tour de France in that regard.
But they're also a bit tone deaf in terms of how they don't seem to realise how this stuff comes across to the wider public. I mean, we've listened to Dave Brailsford talk about a lot of these cases, and they kind of disappear into a bit of a tunnel, don't they? Talking about how much they respect the process when it suits them, and don't respect the process necessarily when it doesn't suit them. I mean,
it's all very well though to be critical. Practically speaking, for example, now, how do they tackle the next 4 days from a PR point of view? I mean, we're not PR professionals, but we are journalists. I mean, what would you do now?
I mean, they could. The problem here is it's not their case to make public all the information pertaining to it, is it?
No, but they've been left holding this grenade by the UCI.
Yeah, but they have a lot of information. They're party to a lot of information that they could put out there.
I think
but then that would be just considered a PR move as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
So
I think the first thing, I mean, I was struck during the Giro when Froome was asked whether he was taking salbutamol during the Giro, and he basically batted that question away and said he wasn't going to answer it. I think that was a big mistake, because if the whole issue of not just Chris Froome, but any athlete taking salbutamol is, there's a medical need for it, and to rid it of its stigma, if asked that question, answer that question honestly. Yes, I am, because
I need it.
I need it. Yeah,
I'd be very shocked if he wasn't taking it now.
Well, yeah. So why not just open up about that? The problem is that his reaction then, it looked like he was hiding something, and I think it was an instinctive. I sense there might be a kind of tripwire here. I'm not quite sure what it is, so I'll take the cautious approach and just bat the question away, as you say. But yeah, that wasn't the best response at all. It just gave birth to a new story.
In all things, really, as the public, and we're all part of the public, but people deal in broad brushstrokes, don't they? If you hear an athlete say, "Yes, I am taking a drug," that it's kind of it doesn't trigger the right response from people, does it? And I think that's the big problem that cycling is in, and professional sport as a whole is in, because medication is a part of their world.
Well, this segues quite neatly into something we'll talk about briefly before we go on to the Tour again, and it's Dr. Richard Freeman's new book called The Line, which is published today as we speak. I read a copy of that last week, and we were offered an interview with him last week, actually, and we couldn't do it for various reasons. But based on the book, it's not a book that's going to satisfy people looking for answers to certain questions. I was very surprised not to see any mention of tramadol in the book. One of the other questions that Richard Freeman has to answer, and he has to answer to the General Medical Council, is about the delivery of testosterone patches to the National Cycling Centre in Manchester. It's quite an interesting insight into sports medicine, and he talks a lot about his role at Bolton Wanderers under Sam Allardyce, the former England football manager, and about his role at British Cycling Team Sky. There are a lot of very interesting case studies. Ed Clancy, for example. There's a lot of triamcinolone administered to athletes, including, of course, Bradley Wiggins. So, it's clear that those athletes wouldn't be named in the book without their consent. So what I took away from it was that an awful lot of athletes had a good relationship with Dr. Freeman, which I knew anyway. A lot of them really enjoyed working with him and felt that he had their best interests at heart. But I think it's a book that will not satisfy people looking for answers to certain questions. Interesting to read in a couple of the interviews that he has given, in the Times especially. he mentioned something that I don't think anybody's really picked up on, but which I found interesting, where he accuses Shane Sutton of having been the source of the famous Jiffy Bag story, saying that Sutton was motivated by trying to get revenge on Bradley Wiggins, with whom he'd fallen out with over a car that he'd promised to buy Shane Sutton after winning the Tour de France in 2012. So I've said a few times on the podcast that much of this story, the Jiffy Bag story and everything around that, was owed to personalities falling out. And I think it does put a little bit more flesh on those bones. He doesn't talk about that at all in his book, which I personally was disappointed with, because I think there's a story there behind the story, which is very interesting, and unfortunately Richard Freeman has not gone into that in his book.
Can I just track back very quickly before we move on? I mentioned earlier that I thought Nike's daily turnover was about 4 times what WADA's annual budget is. I finally worked out how many zeros are in a billion. And it's about what Nike's daily turnover is about 3 times WADA's annual budget.
I'd also like to just point out that Nicolas France won the 1928 Tour de France, a Luxembourger. Could be an omen for Bob Jungels this year. 1918, Lionel? 1908 was Lucien Petit Breton, wasn't it? 1908.
Silver Mice in 1918.
I think we've done that.
Is that right?
Haven't we? I don't know. I'll have to look it up.
We'll have to look that up.
While we're correcting mistakes, I said in last week's podcast that Richie Porte had said in a pro cycling interview that Team Sky riders were not allowed to train with riders from other teams. He did say that. It's in Pro Cycling in black and white. In fact, I have the copy here with me. But apparently it's not true. And there was video last week of Chris Froome training with Philippe Gilbert and Michal Kwiatkowski in the Monaco area.
Also, in Richie Porte news, I understand he's just changed coach, or he's no longer working with David Bailey, who was at BMC up until very, very recently.
Interesting. Well, Lionel, you mentioned earlier that we have just released a special meeting with Jean Bobet. Jean Bobet, the brother of Louis-Jean Bobet, the 3-time Tour de France winner in the 1950s. And I went to see him in Rennes, where he lives. He's 88 years old now. He was a good rider himself, won Paris-Nice, third in Milan-San Remo. 1 year, a fascinating man who studied briefly at Aberdeen University as well, studied Ernest Hemingway there. So a really interesting guy, and really enjoyed meeting him. It was a real privilege. Here's a little extract from that Friend special. You can become a friend of the podcast at thecyclingpodcast.com. Thank you for everyone who has signed up, thecyclingpodcast.com. But here is Jean Bobet.
Anquetil was doping. He said it himself. I had a lot of admiration for him, as I often raced alongside him, as I did at the Tour de France in 1957. I'd seen firsthand how strong he was. However, when he made his confession, it was too much for me. Anquetil's cheating and dishonesty was of such a grand scale that I no longer consider him a great champion. If you don't mind, I'll allow myself to ask the question. Through the eyes of a Frenchman, it seems curious that Lance Armstrong disappeared from the palmarès of the Tour de France and not Jacques Anquetil.
Pour un Français, ça paraît curieux, mais pourquoi Armstrong a disparu du palmarès du Tour de France et pas Anquetil? C'est aussi une injustice.
Paris-Roubaix, Milan-San Remo, Championnat du Monde, Tour des Flandres, Tour de Lombardie, Bordeaux-Paris.
So we continue with Corrections Corner.
Well, Richard,
Lionel.
Of course, trick question, wasn't it? Who won the Tour de France in 1918? There, of course, was no Tour de France in 1918 because of the Great War. The 1919 Tour was won by Fernand Lambeau.
First yellow jersey that year.
Yes.
First time they ever had the yellow jersey.
That's right. Eugene Christophe wore the first yellow jersey. Sylvain Mice, I was decades out. He won in 36 and 39.
Well, 2 times 18 is 36. So
yeah, I'll have that. Yeah.
And Lucien Petit Breton, not Pretty Breton, Petit Breton, was the winner in 1907 and 1908.
This is, yeah.
This is a really good way of looking ahead to the
let's look ahead to
Tour de France.
By looking back 110 years.
Who's going to win? Who's going to win this year, Lionel? See any patterns there for tours ending in the number 8?
Frenchman, no tour, Luxembourger.
Bob Jungels. I mean,
Stop press. While you're considering that, I've just seen some comments from Chris Froome about Bernardino. He's been interviewed today, I think, and he said about Bernardino, I can't say anything bad about Bernard. He's one of the great champions. I imagine with age sometimes your wires get a little bit crossed, a little bit of a dig. But if I see him, I'll very happily explain
punch
it
him
all
in the face
in a bit more detail, because he's certainly got the wrong end of the stick. Now, and we were talking about PR earlier, and I do think it's worth us saying that Chris Froome has dealt with this whole case very well, hasn't he? I think
with the odd slip up, like
with
at
the odd
Giro.
slip up, like at the Giro. But generally speaking, when you consider that it was a leak and that we should not know about this, I think his sort of stiff upper lip has been quite remarkable.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, one of the questions we were asked today was, will he now get the sort of admiration and respect that he is due for winning the Giro, for example? Because although that was an extraordinary performance, it was all carried out under this cloud, wasn't it? It was certainly a performance that a lot of people couldn't really fully enjoy, because there's this question about Froome, about this case, but also still it was not clear in people's minds whether the Giro might subsequently be lost. So you can't go back and, just on Sky, again, though, just one other interesting comment on that before we move on to talk about the tour again is, and I think this building is possibly under attack as I speak, but I was speaking to Ian Boswell last night, the American rider on Team Katusha. Now, he was at Team Sky for a number of years. Just a throwaway comment that he made, that since moving to Katusha, he said he's been far happier doing social media stuff, that the level of abuse and hostility he would get on social media while a Team Sky rider was so intense that it put him off posting. At Katusha, there's deathly silence, really. There's nothing, and that's just quite interesting, and it strikes. It's obviously quite an enjoyable situation for him, but there is this terrible sort of atmosphere around in social media, if I can use that expression, around Team Sky. Now, some of that they have brought on themselves, but it's, the Froome salbutamol case and the reaction to it is about far more than the salbutamol case and whether he went over the limit for salbutamol that day at the Vuelta.
Yeah, I think go back to what I said before about trust. I mean, trust in professional cycling is in short supply. Because of the past and because of the, people see parallels and patterns. They see Team Sky's dominance and they equate it to US Postal and Lance Armstrong's dominance, and they think that it can't be achieved any other way. I mean, again, just, it's not me saying it, but Jonathan Vaughters, who raced in that Armstrong era, and is a team boss in this era, he said very clearly, it is night and day. That doesn't mean that doping has been entirely eradicated. It doesn't mean that that some athletes are operating in grey areas, but it does mean that we have to put it into a perspective and treat it accordingly. And I think that's the legacy of this Chris Froome situation, which has dragged on, but probably been resolved in around about the time that we would have expected based on previous cases. The problem is that it's brought right to the fore on the eve of the Tour de France, and there's the risk of unpredictable, unintended consequences, and I think that no one really has taken that into consideration.
Should we move on to the Tour?
Yeah,
let's do that. I mean, the one thing about racing now is it's very, very close, isn't it? The margins are very, very small, and Froome will go into its favour. I mean, the Giro result, the Giro performance, the fact that he was strong in the third week, and the fact that this case has now been concluded, Froome will go into it in a very positive frame of mind, I imagine. I guess the big question is, what will be the cost of the Giro in his legs? It's interesting thinking about the Vuelta, because the Vuelta, of course, last year was the second Grand Tour of the year, And as we've seen in a lot of Grand Tours that Froome has ridden and won, he has faded a little bit, and he's also often fallen ill in the final week. And the illness can be accumulation of fatigue and everything. So I think the big test for Froome is, going to come in the third week, obviously. And, he could be vulnerable in that third week. He's got a very strong team, of course, as well.
Yeah, he has, and I think the third week might be where we see that fatigue, but a lot of fatigue will have been accumulated in the first 9 days leading up to the stage over the cobbles of Paris-Roubaix, and the mental toll of those days could be quite steep for a lot of riders. I think his team does look very strong. I think the fact that Tony Galopin, if we talk about a head-to-head between AG2R and Sky and Romain Bardet and Froome, I think the fact that Tony Galopin crashed in the French National Championships at the weekend, and I think he's broken a rib, but he's still going to ride the Tour de France. That's a big blow to AG2R, because I think the team time trial on stage 3 is going to be a big showdown, and it's extremely important for AG2R because we saw at the Dauphiné, Bardet, although he's always aggressive and he's very consistent, has still not found a way to really land a mortal blow on the best climbers in the world. So if he's also losing a lot of time in the team time trial, and that is the only time trial before the race gets to the mountains, then I think it's going to be very difficult for Bardet. Of the other contenders, Nibali has the experience. I don't think his team is as strong as Team Sky. Quintana looked very good in the Tour of Switzerland. It's going to be fascinating to see how Movistar work it with Landa, Quintana and Valverde. I think the personality, the sort of blending those personalities and making them work together is going to be fascinating because they're very different.
Do you not think that the list of potential winners is longer than it has been for a number of years, really?
I mentioned Dumoulin.
Yeah, Froome and Dumoulin have both ridden the Giro, so watching them match up against each other will be really interesting. Everyone else is kind of, relatively speaking, fresh. Quintana, as you mentioned, has got the advantage of strength in depth at Movistar, but how does that play out on the road? It's not just a case that we're strong, so we'll wait for the mountains. There's all sorts of possibilities for difficulty in that first 9 days. Peloton being slightly smaller, maybe crashes will be a little bit less of a factor, but there's the possibility of crosswinds. Everything leading up to the nerves are going to start jangling 2-3 days out from the cobbled stage, aren't they? And that cobbled stage really could create havoc. You could see gaps of 2-3 minutes opening up between some of the GC riders before they even get into the mountains.
Speaking to a couple of riders who've recce'd that cobbled stage, the entrance to the very first cobbled section, which happens quite early, is incredibly narrow, apparently. So there'll be a real fight to get there first. I also think the early sprint stages could be pretty chaotic because there's no hierarchy really there that's very open. There's lots of sprinters, lots of teams that will fancy it.
And there are a lot of teams going in with a sprinter and maybe 2 or 3 guys allocated to that sprinter, whereas in the past it's been 4 or 5 guys, which could make it more chaotic. It could actually, or it could make it slightly safer. At the Giro we saw without big trains that there weren't that many crashes, and hopefully for all concerned that's the case. I mean, I think the sprints are going to be fascinating. We talked last week about this sort of power vacuum. There's no one that really stands out as the dominant sprinter. Everyone's coming in with some kind of question mark. I spoke to Mark Cavendish last week. He's had obviously some issues with crashes. He says he's the skinniest, the lightest he's been since his time at Team Sky, but he's had some issues this year. He's been he hasn't been thrilled with his bike at certain times, and there's some work to do on that. And he's coming in with without Birnie Eisel, who's one of his loyal companions over the last few years, but a lead-out train that, to my mind, looks very experienced and very good, with Van Rensburg, who was outstanding in last year's Tour, Bassenhagen and Renshaw. But it's going to be really interesting to see what batting order he adopts and how he uses those 3 riders.
Do you not think the sprint field is so chaotic because there are so many riders who potentially could win? In the Giro, it's really like Viviani, Bennett and maybe 1 or 2 others on a lower level, whereas at the Tour, just running through the sprinters who are turning up, Alexander Kristoff, Dylan Groenewegen, Fernando Gaviria, Andre Greipel, Marcel Kittel, Arnaud Demar, Mark Cavendish, of course. You know, that's a pretty deep. Peter Sagan, who could win
all 9 stages, first 9 stages.
He could win all 9 stages up to the rest day. He's not going to win the team time trial. I don't think Bora Hansgrohe will win that. But
they've got a good team for that, though. A lot of Bodnar, people like that.
Sagan is the sprinter over whom there are the fewest question marks. I would suggest we know that he's perhaps. When everyone is sprinting out their best, he's maybe not the fastest, but he's always in the top 3, and he always finds a way of getting into the mix, doesn't he?
Surely will.
He has worn the yellow jersey, hasn't he?
Yes.
In 2012, I think.
Yeah. Interestingly, this new bonus sprint that will be coming in the latter stages of each stage up to the Paris-Roubaix stage on stage 9, 3, 2 and 1 second on offer. Also 10, 6 and 4 seconds on offer for every road stage throughout the race. Lots of bonus seconds available, presumably just to keep it lively and interesting in those first 9 days. No prologue time trial, of course. The team time trial could see some gaps open up, but there's enough in the time bonuses that you could still see the lead changing hands after the Cholet team time trial.
And on the sprinters, Lionel, just one sprinter who won't be there is Nasser Bouhanni, who's not been selected by Cofidis. Based on everything we've heard and seen over the past few months and weeks, I think it's probably a sensible decision. They're taking Christophe Laporte as their main sprinter. There was this issue at the Route Occitanie it's called, isn't it? Where they both sprinted and there was a bit of a misunderstanding, and Bouhanni has not been happy for a few months. Cofidis have not been happy with him. He's got a year left on his contract. Their team manager came out, or their team sort of principal came out, the sponsor came out today and said that they still think that he's going to be riding for Cofidis in 2019, but the relations have really soured there. So I'm not surprised at all they haven't picked him.
Cofidis have not won a Tour de France stage for 10 years.
I think they will this year.
You think they will?
A very good season.
Who, with Laporte?
I think Laporte's got a chance on
Herrada. Yeah.
I think Laporte couldn't be competitive in the sprints. He probably won't win a sprint, but can be competitive on various different types of terrain. And they've got Herrada. Even Julien Simon has never really excelled in the Tour de France, but they've got 4 or 5 riders who I would say are in with a shout.
10 years without a stage win for a team that was considered the sort of the giant of French cycling back in the day. A bit sort of
who won that stage in 2008?
It was Sylvain Chavanel in Montluçon, and Chavanel will be lining up for his 18th tour for Direct Energy. Probably won't win a stage, but his teammate Lilian Calmejean might.
Just back
if
on.
He wins a stage, since I have a fantastic record of predicting Lilian Calmejean stage wins. The stage that Lilian Calmejean will win, if any, is the one that finishes. Is there a stage that finishes in Carcassonne or just?
Yes, there is. Yeah,
it's that one.
Hey, Sam Dumoulin must have won a stage for Cofidis in 2008 as well.
That was beforehand. Yeah, that was the one.
I don't know why I call him Sam, but. Sam.
That was at the start of the race, and Chavanel won right towards the end.
He was Cofidis 2008. Yeah, just back to Movistar quickly, because I'm fascinated by this Landa, Quintana, Valverde triumvirate. How is that going to play out? It's all about, presuming they get through the first 9 stages okay, and they survive the cobbles and so on. They're all pretty evenly placed when they get to the first mountains. Is it a race within a race? I mean, is it whoever's the strongest, and will Quintana and Landa be kind of going head to head when they get to the mountains almost? Because who that team supports. Well, I haven't mentioned Marc Soler. He's another kind of dark horse in that team as well. But how is that going to play out? Because Landa and Quintana are the 2 strong candidates to be leader of that team. How is that decided?
I think it might come down to personal relationships with some of the domestiques. I mean, Erviti is someone who has ridden with and raced with Quintana for a number of years and is considered to be probably his most loyal lieutenant, certainly on the flat. But Valverde is a more popular figure in the organisation. Landa it's always a bit of a mystery. And it's difficult to, and it might come down to the particular director sportif who's making the decisions on that day, who's usually Jose Luis Arrieta on the Tour de France.
Yeah, with Landa, I mean, everyone remembers last year when he was looking so good on the stage to Périgueux in the Pyrenees, and really his body language and facial expression was saying, I am stronger than Chris Froome, but I'm not allowed to go anywhere or do anything. And he was pretty obvious about that at the finish, wasn't he? The thing is, it's fairly rare that the race doesn't sort things out. I mean, we could reach the Alps with the hierarchy in Movistar well and truly decided simply because of what has happened in the previous 9 stages. But
the rider most likely to do okay on the cobbles is Valverde.
Yeah.
Yes, of
and
course.
Soler, maybe.
Of course.
He rode Paris-Roubaix this year, didn't he? He rode all right.
But the fascinating aspect of that is if Landa has a problem, who waits, who works. If Quintana has a problem, who waits, who works, and we'll maybe have to find out. Will they allocate certain domestiques to?
It's going to be a daily soap opera. I think,
it is.
Movistar.
Yeah.
And our old friend Fran Reis is going to be at the Tour this year as well, working. So maybe we'll try and grab him occasionally to get his insight into the Spanish team. We should leave it there.
Certainly should.
We need to get to France in a couple of days. Where we'll be joined by Francois Thomazeau. Daniel, will you be able to join us? Television's Daniel
The odd cameo.
If you become Television's Daniel Friebe, will you be able to? I think the monthly retainer should mean that you join us for the occasional.
Should be duty bound, to join you
whenever you can, when you see us.
Press conference, am I invited?
Oh, you're invited to that, if you want to join in with the press conference.
What if I get sacked midway through the race by my other employer? Can I join you then? Can I be a full-time fixture?
Well, we can reach some kind of arrangement on expenses and stuff.
Would we have to pay a loan fee? That's the key. The thing is, the first rest day is not really a rest day, is it? We've got to drive from Lille to Annecy.
I'm getting a plane.
Are you indeed?
But I think I'm going to miss the World Cup final.
Ah.
Oh, well, wouldn't worry about that. I see. Maybe that'll give Quintana a real boost, wouldn't it, if Colombia win the World Cup?
It'll be England, France.
Anyway, we should leave it there. That's all from us for now, and we'll speak to you in France. Thank you, Lionel.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Cycling Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate us and leave a review on Facebook and iTunes. Just search online for the Cycling Podcast. This episode was edited and produced by Matt Field.